Rahab again where we left off. Last week, Rahab had, again, a very unique position. Again, not only is she a Gentile woman, but also because of her occupation, she would have been the prime type of example that you would not think that God would use to help accomplish his will, and that's exactly what's going to happen. In chapter 2, it's already in the process of happening by the fact that she was willing to hide the two spies that came into Jericho, but now that's going to be very clear based on what she's going to do in response, because her role in this whole process is not yet through. So, Joshua 2, we're going to look at verses 12 through 14. What are the key points? One key point that's going to stand out to us is that family can be very important. We know that for Rahab, as we're going to see, what motivates her to act is not just the concept of her own self-preservation, but one of the reasons why she is going to respond the way that she does is because she's also thinking about where does her family fit in with what's about to happen. It's not just her, she's also thinking about the concern of the family. And obviously we'll tie that in as well in a moment. We also know that commitment extends into all aspects of life. And that will be true based on what the two spies are going to mention to the woman, or mention to Rahab in this passage. It's going to be a very important point that Rahab continues with that commitment, and that this is not simply a statement of affirmation at the very beginning of this account, and that Rahab doesn't continue with it. Instead, it's the point that this level of commitment extends into all aspects of life. So those are two things to think about as we go along, and hopefully we can point out why those key points can stand out when we look at the latter half of Joshua chapter 2. So let's begin with Rahab's request, and that is given to us in verses 12 through 14. Give me a second, let me get there. All right, Joshua chapter 2, beginning in verse 12. Again, keep in mind that this is in the same context after Rahab has described, as we said last week, why she did what she did. But now, verse 12, her request, "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house and give me a sure sign, that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death." And the men said to her, "Our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you." All right, so notice again that her request is to preserve my family and I. And this is why we say that one of the, at least in my mind, one of the key things to think about in this passage is that point, how family can also be kind of a motivation for doing what God wants to. Rahab is certainly not just concerned about her own self-preservation in the fact that Jericho is about to be destroyed, the Gentile population is about to be destroyed. She's not thinking about just herself, but she also wants to ensure that her family is protected in the process of it. Again, gives her more motivation to do what she knows the will of the Lord to be. Because as we already saw in her explanation last week, Rahab is very clear that what the Israelites have been doing is coming at the hand of God, and that same surety of what they've already done is exactly what will happen to Jericho. Jericho will be destroyed. I don't want to be destroyed, nor do I want to see my family be destroyed. Thus, not just the reason why I'm doing this, but also now, make sure that my family is preserved, as she is building off of, just as I was kind to you, so you also be kind to me. Again, we also see from this God's concern for the obedient Gentiles. And I'm going to put all three of these things up as we talk about it. Dad, could you get me some water, if you don't mind. I'm still not 100%, so if I talk a lot, I wind up coughing. But God's concern for the obedient Gentiles. We know that this is a book where, a lot of people make the argument that the consequence of this book is that God is only concerned about the annihilation of the Canaanites. He's only concerned about the annihilation of the people who are not a part of the children of God. Well, this book and this account is again given to us to remind us that God did care for the condition of the Gentile population. And that's obviously true by the fact that Rahab and her household will be saved, as we'll see later on. Again, reminding us that while the command was given to wipe out the entire Canaanite population, that did not mean that God was not observant to recognize that there were some individuals who were worthy of being saved. That, of course, being, in this case, Rahab and her household. And that's important to keep in mind. Notice, too, that in order to ensure, for her sake, the preservation of her family and herself, that she requires these two spies to make an oath of faithfulness. Again, verse 12, please swear to me by the Lord. Which further gives us an indication that she does have a very clear idea about who the God of Israel is. Look for a moment at Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 13 through 15 as evidenced by this. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 13 through 15. And if somebody would read that passage for us.
Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God and serve him, and shalt swear by his name. You shall not go after other gods, or of the gods of the people which are round about you. For the Lord thy God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord thy God be kindled against thee, and destroy thee from off the face of the earth.
So notice that in that passage, the points being made to the people of God is that when they did make an oath or, swear in the context that they're talking about there, that they were to invoke the name of God. And what that meant is that when they swore by the name of the God of Israel, that was their recognition that they were going to be submissive to his laws, right? That they were going to be obedient to him. And in other words, when you make an oath to the Lord, as we've kind of already talked about in other Old Testament passages, that's not an oath that you are going to break. Again, in that context, it's also reminding us about the uniqueness of God, the exclusiveness of God, the fact that they were to make that oath, and at the same time, when they made that oath, they would not follow after other gods. And so, in other words, the point is that Rahab knows that when a person of God, right, one of the children of Israel, when they made that oath, the consequence was they're not going to break that oath, right, because God expects them to keep it. These are not individuals who are polytheistic, where they can make a promise to one God and it not mean a big deal because they could say something else to another God. They're only making a promise to one entity, and they're not going to break that promise. Again, Rahab is a person who recognizes the God of Israel, and as a consequence knows that that is going to be an oath that they will stick by if they agree to it. And that's exactly what they say when we go back to Joshua chapter 2. They're going to be faithful to that. As we'll see, they'll add something on in a minute as well. But again, notice that the preservation of self comes from thinking about the entire family. I know this passage, referenced it, I think, a couple of months ago in a sermon I think Brother Wayne did, but you think about 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 2. You think about the occasion where Peter is dealing with a woman who is a faithful Christian, and she is dealing with living with an unbelieving spouse. And what did Peter tell that woman in 1 Peter 3, verses 1 and 2 about her example?
You might win him by your example.
Yeah, it basically says to the extent that you may win him over by the example of your conduct. And that's the point, is that when Peter is addressing this woman and addressing a difficult situation in which she's the spiritual head of that household, Peter's telling her, right, think about your husband in this situation, right? When you think about this relationship that you're having to deal with, think about how you are going to impact him spiritually. Because that's the point, is you want to win him over, right? You want to see him converted. So think about your family when it comes to that relationship. Ephesians chapter 6 talks about the responsibilities of children to their parents and fathers to their children. And again, children are supposed to be obedient to their parents, to honor them. Fathers are not supposed to, and mothers essentially are included in that. The parents aren't supposed to, invoke their children to wrath. And the point is think about your family, right? And when you think about your family, you're thinking about the spiritual condition of your household. In other words, Rahab is willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that her family is safe. And that's the same mindset spiritually we have to have today, right? Within our household, within our family members, we should be willing to do whatever is necessary in order to ensure their spiritual survival, in order to have a strong household. Here it's Rahab doing the action in that regard, but for all of us as Christians, we have a responsibility to think about our families and to think about how can we preserve them, specifically spiritually speaking, how can we preserve them, to make sure that they don't incur the wrath of God on the day of judgment, right? So that they are obedient to him, as what Rahab wanted for her household, right? So preserve my family and I. And so the spies give another condition in verse 14. The men said to her, our life for yours, even to death, if you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. In other words, here's the spies' condition. Do not betray us, or in other words, ensure your commitment to us. The point is that the spies are telling her, Rahab, you've made a decision to support us. You've made a decision to get behind God's will in this situation by preserving our lives. And they're telling Rahab, don't turn your back on us. Don't turn your back on God at this point. If you do not tell this business of ours, right? If she rats them out, if she tells this business to the king or to those looking for them, well, she hasn't honored that commitment. And obviously she wouldn't be protected. The spies are telling her, do not betray us. Do not betray God's purpose here. Be faithful. Stay faithful. Stay committed to what you have done thus far. In other words, we get that idea, right, that commitment extends further than just what she has done up to this point. Commitment's got to last the entire way. You can think about a parallel here to what Jesus said in Luke 17 and verse 32 when he warned his disciples to remember who? Remember Lot's wife. Because what was the problem with Lot's wife when you go back to the book of Genesis, when they left Sodom and Gomorrah? She turned around and looked, even though she was told specifically, do not look back on Sodom and Gomorrah. And why did she turn her back and look back on Sodom and Gomorrah?
She longed for what she was leaving behind.
Yeah. The context that Jesus is putting at in Luke 17 is the idea that Lot's wife turned around almost regretting making the decision to go with Lot and to get out of Sodom and Gomorrah. In other words, she regretted turning her back on essentially the past sinful condition she had been living in terms of living in that type of society. That's the same thing for Rahab here, right? Don't turn your back to look back to Jericho, to the life that you've got in Jericho, right? If you're committed to us, be ready to have a completely new condition in life is the point, right? Don't look back on this past life. The same point is when it comes to us as Christians, we can look at Rahab's example here and make this connection to ourselves. You know, we all make a commitment to follow after God, but there can't come a point in time where we say, well, it's time for us, or it's an acceptable time for us to go back on that commitment. In Luke 9, verse 62, Jesus talked about an example of a man that was farming. And he said that no man who puts his hand to the plow and turns back is fit for what? The kingdom of God. Luke 9:62, no man that puts his hand to the plow and turns back is fit for the kingdom of God. Jesus' point there was the same point the spies are making. You've made this commitment to me. If you turn your back on me, you're not fit for the kingdom of God. You're not fit for salvation is the point. Hebrews 6, verses 4 and 6, a passage we're not going to read, but it deals with the same concept where Christians in that day were trying to go back to the law of Moses as a easy way in their mind of seeking salvation. And the point that the writer of Hebrews was making in that passage was that there is no repentance, there is no forgiveness of sins for those who decide to turn their back on Christ and not honor the commitment that they had made. That point was true for Rahab. She could not turn her back on this decision that she's made. The application for us is the same. We've made a commitment to Christ when we obey Him, when we put Him on in baptism. There's no point in time in which we can go back on that commitment and expect God to preserve us in the day of destruction, in the day of judgment in that regard. That's the condition that the spies now set out. They also now give a sign to Rahab as a token, at least of their escape, as we'll see in a minute. Notice now verses 15 and 16 says that she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was built into the city wall, so that she lived in the wall. And she said to them, go into the hills, of the pursuers will encounter you, and hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Then afterward you may go your way. We may forget, right, for the spies, the danger is not over. Again, keep in mind the king has already sent out a military search party to find these spies and to presumably execute them. So they've got to be careful even at this point. So again, we see from verse 15, she lets them down by a rope through the window of her house. Again, the picture, I believe, on the past slide gives us a pretty good indication of that. And we notice here we've got a picture of a replica, at least, of the city of Jerusalem, or not Jerusalem, Jericho. And at least archaeologists seem to think that Jericho was what was called a double-walled city. So Rahab's house, again, because of the nature of her, her house being a harlot's house, again, men often would probably not want other people to know that they've been visiting there. A lot of times those houses were not going to be in the middle of a city. Instead, they're going to be on the outskirts, and hence why her house is built into the side of the wall. Also is going to make it easier for them to possibly escape, because they're not going to have to travel throughout the entire city, simply being on the outskirts of it. And so the wall, at least the house being built into the wall, would probably be a reference to the outer wall within the city. Again, you're not just going to, since they are looking for these spies are not just going to be able to exit the main gate of the city. Otherwise, they get detected and they get captured. So, again, while they're let down by a window and detection, in verse 16, Rahab says, go into the hill, will encounter you, and to hide in those hills for 3 days until the pursuers have returned. And what she's talking about here is that, remember that the main encampment of the Israelites was somewhere in the neighborhood of Abel Shittim, or the Acacia Grove, east of the Jordan River. And with this being the city of Jericho, the king's pursuers would have went east toward the Jordan River to try to find those spies. And so what Rahab tells them in verse 16 is perhaps to go to the hills, which would be southwest of Jericho, hide out for 3 days, and then when the pursuers come back to Jericho, that's when they could leave the hills and go back to the encampment of the Israelites. In other words, that's why we said, don't go east. The pursuers are there, and they're looking for you. Again, this is maybe not exact, but this is supposed to be kind of southwest of Jericho. Obviously today. And you get the concept here, right? You got these hills, smaller mountains, much easier to hide out, much more difficult to pursue after. And that's what she tells them, right? Go and hide out in these mountains, and then when they come back into the city, go south of Jericho, and then go back to the main encampment, right, to avoid detection. So the sign to Rahab then is the scarlet cord. Notice verse 17, that the men said to her, we will be guiltless with respect to this oath of yours that you have made us swear. Behold, when we come into the land, you shall tie this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. And you shall gather into your house your father and mother, your brothers, and all your father's household. Then if anyone goes out of the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we shall be guiltless. But if a hand is laid on anyone who is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head. But if you tell this business of ours, then we shall be guiltless with respect to your oath that you have made us swear. And she said, according to your word, so be it. Then she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. And this is, again, an artist's depiction of what that scarlet cord might have looked like. We don't necessarily know exactly what it would have looked like. But that's the point, is that in this situation, which is about to be very chaotic, when they, as we're going to see in a couple of chapters, when they go into the city and they start to eliminate the population, that's a battle zone, and as a consequence, things get really chaotic. So there's got to be a clear way for the individuals who are going to go into the city to know that this is Rahab's house. Again, with the exception of these two spies, none of the other men who are going to go into the city know who Rahab is. They don't have pictures. They don't know what she looks like. They don't know what her house looks like. But for whatever reason, this scarlet cord is going to be the key identification feature of her house. Again, keep in mind that we said last week that Rahab had flax on top of her house, and that was used to help produce linen and clothing and things like that. And so that could also be an indication that, with Rahab having that on the top of her house, that this is also another way of, identifying that this is Rahab's house. The flax on the top of the house would be hard to see, but the scarlet cord would not be. And they needed that to make sure that her household was preserved. The color scarlet, when you go back to the Old Testament, was an important color to the Jewish population. In Leviticus 14, you read about how scarlet yarn was a part of the process in which lepers would be cleansed under the law of Moses. Some have pointed out that maybe that's the connection here, is that the color scarlet kind of represented Rahab's, at least her house, being clean, in the sense of being clean in the midst of the rest of Jericho's destruction. Again, maybe why they suggested scarlet, because the Jews recognized that color with spiritual cleanliness. Whatever the case is, the point is that Rahab had to follow through with it. And as we know in verse 21, there's really not any delay given, that as soon as they departed, she went and tied the scarlet cord in the window. Again, a reminder to us that if Rahab and her household wanted to be preserved, she now had to put that scarlet cord outside of her window. She couldn't delay in doing that. She couldn't make the argument, well, is this really going to make that big of a deal? Is this really important to the preservation of my house? When they give her that, when they give her that requirement to put the scarlet cord outside the window, would make her stand out, but Rahab didn't really care about that, right? She did that. That's obviously going to contribute to why her household is going to be saved. So, yes, what she's done up to this point is good, but if she wanted to be preserved in the end, she now had to put the scarlet cord outside of her window. Again, that's a simple reminder to us as Christians. We can be Christians for 20, 30 years, but if we don't honor that commitment until the point in which we leave this earth, it's not going to matter what we did for 20 or 30 years. It matters where we're at the end. And so that's why Rahab will be preserved by verse 21. She is going to, she's going to, we'll see later, she's going to be preserved. Again, don't leave the house, right? That's also given, right? If anyone goes outside of the house, his blood shall be on his own head. Or in otherwise, you go outside of your house in the midst of this, you're going to be destroyed. So what that showed is that for Rahab, she had to be able to trust the faithfulness of God's people. Again, they're going to be people outside of her house. She has no idea who they are. People that she's going to hear killing others, may even see them killing others. But the point is that she has got to trust God's people to do the right thing. And, we can't, that doesn't always happen, but as Christians, there should be a level of trust that we should have for God's people. The two spies are trying to tell her, look, you can trust us, and you have to trust us in order to be saved. As Christians, again, we have to be willing to trust God's people because we're going to need God's people to help us make sure that we are faithful to God. Again, Galatians 6, to help us overcome our own spiritual problems. We need the people of God's help as a consequence. And obviously, this is a reminder to us of the Passover of Exodus 12, right, where the blood was spread on the doorpost of the house, much like the scarlet cord is hung over the outside the window. That's how you're that's the means of preservation. And again, Rahab had to stay true to that. She had to make sure that her family members stayed true to that. Otherwise, as the spies said, if you're killed by not abiding by these regulations, it's your own fault. But as the spies also guaranteed, right, if Rahab's family did exactly as they were told, and somebody, one of the men of God went in there and killed them, then that man of God is going to be killed as a consequence, is the point. Or at least he's going to be guilty for executing an innocent woman and her family in that regard. And we'll come back and connect that again with what will happen later with the actual destruction of Jericho. But because of Rahab's example and her faithfulness now to God, the spies are able to get back to Joshua. Again, notice verse 22 that it says that they departed and went into the hills and remained there 3 days until the pursuers returned. And the pursuers searched all along the way and found nothing. Then the two men returned. They came down from the hills and passed over and came to Joshua the son of Nun, and they told him all that had happened to them. And they said to Joshua, Truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also the inhabitants of the land melt away because of this. So the spies did exactly as Rahab said. They hide out for 3 days by taking an indirect route to get back, and they're not found. That gives them the ability to now go and talk to Joshua. And actually, their whole point, when we go back to the beginning of chapter 2, was that they were supposed to go and spy out the land, specifically to spy out the city of Jericho. We talked about that the importance of their mission was not to get feedback on what these people looked like, how strong they were, like what happened in the book of Numbers, but what was critical was what is the mindset of the people in the city of Jericho. And they got that from, the spies got that mindset from what Rahab said about the people, and now they're going to report that to Joshua. And no hesitation, right? There's going to be no hesitation about what to do next. When the spies came back in the book of Numbers, we're very familiar with that. With the exception of Joshua and Caleb, the other 10 spies were all about hesitating with the proposed entry into the land of Canaan, right? When they complained about how big the people were, how it was impossible for the Israelites who were too small to overcome these people. Notice now that when these two spies get back, all it says to Joshua in verse 24 is, truly, the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. So no hesitation, right? Very assured that God has now given them the land for the Israelites to take over. And in part, that's going to be because the inhabitants of the land are clearly afraid of the Israelites, hearkening back to what Rahab has already said about how they know what happened at the Red Sea and what had happened to the Amorite kings of Sihon and Og. So, Joshua, let's go in. No hesitation. I think what's also important to point out, too, is that they give this report solely to Joshua. There's no meeting of the elders of the people or the leaders of the tribes. There's no general assembly that's formed to hear the news that the spies give to Joshua. This is all given directly to Joshua himself and only to Joshua. And that's because Joshua, we know as a man of faith, is not going to waver at God's commitment, perhaps like what the people did in Numbers 12. And that reminds us that, we, as a country, we like the idea of having, democratic values, but there comes a point in time where some things are not supposed to be democratic. In other words, there are times where somebody's got to make a decision and it's not left up to the vote of the general population, right? The church doesn't operate in that way. Christ is the head of the church. All the authority rests in him. What Christ says through the New Testament goes for what the New Testament church should do. You have elders underneath that are supposed to shepherd the flock. And while we may not like to think about it, sometimes that form of structure is much more effective at getting things done. And so Joshua is going to obviously use his authority as leader to lead the way moving forward. But sometimes as Christians, we have to remind ourselves, yes, we like our democratic values as Americans, but there is a point to why in the church that Christ is the head. We have elders to oversee the local congregation, and we have to simply get behind and do what they say rather than trying to give our own opinion about what should be done. Church wasn't designed to be a democracy because in a lot of ways, sometimes democracies don't work very efficiently. Here, again, things will because Joshua is the final vote. Christ is the final vote in the church. The church does well when it simply listens to, the words of Christ in the New Testament and does exactly what he says without our opinion on it. With that being said, are there any final comments on what we've talked about today?
That speaks very well of Rahab and her ability to keep quiet. Some things don't need to be spread. If she got on the phone, so to speak, and told everybody in the country what was about to happen, well, that would have been curtains for her, and that would have undermined the spy's mission. So, James talks about trying to control the tongue, and she did a good job of keeping that secret.
Right. Absolutely. It's why she and her household are going to be preserved, as we'll see later on. But thank you for your time and your attention this morning. We'll pick up in